Today I want to talk about how and in what way we own things. That is about property. And I think we don't really have very good general principles of property in the United States, although our practice is pretty good. And so I want to talk about property rights and see if we can put them in some kind of broad perspective. I think there is one fundamental principle that governs property, and that's this. If you look at all the property in the world, all the things, the resources in the world, those things are intended so that all of mankind can develop themselves. I mean, each of us have some kind of goal in life. We're supposed to aim at developing ourselves, our excellences, our talents, our abilities. We try to strive to increase in virtue. But for many of these things, we need resources of some sort. And so the question is, how do we most effectively make sure that the resources of the world are accessible to people who need them in order to do what they're supposed to do, which is to develop themselves? I think there are three main ways that have been put forward as the most effective ways to achieve this. And this, by the way, is called the universal destination of goods. The first way is the idea of everything being owned and used in common. But there are some fairly significant problems with this. I mean, it's certainly true it can work at a small level of community. For example, the early Christians did this. They owned everything in common and distributed according to need. However, once you get to larger communities, it's very difficult to do this for a couple of reasons. First of all, if everybody owns something, nobody feels a specific responsibility for it. And so property doesn't get taken care of very well. And then second, you have the problem of free riders. That is, some people who are certainly willing to have common use in terms of the distribution, but aren't willing to contribute their efforts to expand resources. So communism, or a kind of radical socialism, has never been particularly effective for those reasons over time. The second way of doing things is to have everything privately owned and privately used. And this has some attractive advantages. It's something that many individualists and libertarians in the United States tend to gravitate toward. But there are a couple of significant problems with it. One is that it's very hard to just justify a particular division of property at a given time. You take the way property is divided nowadays and say that, okay, there should be absolute private property rights. But is it true that the division of rights we have now is necessarily just? I mean, part of it certainly is. I mean, some people have, worked hard or worked better in order to earn their property, and they certainly deserve the fruits of their labor. But the problem is that, maybe people didn't really do that. Is the fact that somebody's father or great-grandfather or great-grandfather really worked hard a sufficient justification for their descendants to necessarily have more, especially if they have a lot more than others? I mean, it's not so clear that that's the most fair thing. Not only that, some people who have property, a fair amount of property, can actually, if you trace it back, go back to some time when somebody didn't actually earn it, but just stole it. I mean, there's a lot of examples of that in life, right? Where people who successfully got property, got resources in underhanded ways. And so to simply take the division of property at a given time and say, well, this is absolutely just, seems to be problematic. And then there's a second problem with the pure private property, private ownership, private use approach. And that is that some people may not get what they need with no fault of their own. Because it's certainly possible that somebody might be born into circumstances. I mean, just think of how many, starving children there are in Africa. It's hard to say those children are starving to death at age 5 because they didn't work hard enough. So, while private ownership accomplishes some things, it doesn't completely effectively make accessible to everybody the property that everybody needs. So what's the third mechanism for trying to make sure that we achieve the universal destination of goods? I think the third approach is a combination that many people don't think of, and that is private ownership but common use. Now, what does that mean? Well, basically it means that if you have a system of private property set up well, there are ways in order to assure that property is accessible to everybody. Now, private property is very, very valuable, and it accomplishes a lot of good things. One reason is that it invokes people's self-interest. And given human beings as we know them, having a definite self-interest in something tends to stimulate effort. It makes people attend to it more, take care of it, use it better. So self-interest is one thing. Now, second thing, some people don't consider self-interest all that great or noble a motivation. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of self-interest is perfectly good. For instance, when the father of a family, the mother of a family go out and work to support their family, in one sense that's self-interest, but family life provides the opportunity for a great deal of sacrifice within the family unit. You know, parents taking care of their kids, sacrificing themselves for their kids. And so that kind of self-interest is actually often quite noble. Another reason private property is so good is because it enables families to take care of themselves. You know, the whole idea that a family has its private property that makes it possible to take care of all the members of the family is a very desirable thing. Why? Well, for both a negative reason and a positive reason. The negative reason, you might say, is it's always dangerous for a family simply to be dependent on others. Because if they're dependent on others, that means others may exercise power and control over them that can be abused. And so having a certain independence is desirable. And there's a more positive reason as well, which is not just rooted in the failings or faults of mankind. And that is the idea that if the family takes responsibility for itself in order to arrange for the things that it needs, then it's going to be engaging in activity that brings forth their talents, their capacities, their abilities. That is, they're going to develop themselves. And that self-development, that increase in human excellence, that's part of what the whole goal of human life is. And so private property is very valuable for that reason. Another reason is that there's a real justice in saying that when people take raw materials and by their labor improve them and increase them, then there's a fundamental justice in the fact that they're having made that effort, put themselves into it, that they should get some reward for that. And so in order to achieve that justice, private property goes a long way. And then finally, it's also a way of avoiding bitter public disputes. If everything's owned in common and there have to be common decisions about how to divvy up things among people, that can often result in quite bitter disputes. So if it's possible to divide things so that people have private ownership, you can avoid a lot of those disputes. So private property is very, very valuable. So how do we achieve common use with the system of private property, though? Because we want to make sure that we have not just private property, but we want to achieve that universal destination of human goods. Well, there are a number of different ways. The first thing to notice is that in any system of private property, typically people don't simply hoard the property. They go out and they use it. They engage in some productive activity of some sort. And when they do that, they're actually contributing not just to themselves, but also to the common good. For example, most of us tend to specialize. We work in a particular line of work, producing some good or service. And then other people specialize in other things, and then we have exchange. And by the specialization, we add to the resources of society, and by the distribution, we're able to spread that out over a lot of people. So even an ordinary system of private property with free enterprise and a free market of exchange achieves the common good to a considerable extent. But in addition to this, there's another very important moral principle. And this is one that some American conservatives have trouble with. And it's this idea that if we have superfluous wealth, wealth over and above the basic needs of our family, then it's not just a good idea, but it's a moral obligation to share that superfluous wealth with others, to use it somehow, not just for our private good, but for the common good. Now, sometimes people, when they think about this, they just think in terms of, well, government takes the money and then they give it to other people. But it's much more complicated than that. It's certainly true that one very important way we can use our superfluous wealth is to share it with the needy, especially perhaps those people who, through no fault of their own, don't have the basic resources that they need. I mean, and as I've said earlier, in terms of talking about the distribution of property, there are probably a lot of people in the world who really don't have what they need for reasons having nothing to do with their own fault, although of course there's other people as well who don't have them because they simply haven't exerted themselves. But there's a division of both. And so certainly giving to the needy is a very important use, something that really is morally demanded of society. But there are other ways as well of using property for the common good. Just for the record, it doesn't have to be just contributing to material poverty. For example, spending money on the education of your own children, spending money on education and knowledge generally. I mean, supporting a university so that others have access to that knowledge that benefits society. Support for the arts. Support for groups in political life or in law might be a way of contributing to the benefit of society as a whole. So there are lots of different ways to contribute to the common good. Moreover, there are different ways for people to make sure that their superfluous wealth is shared with others for the common good. I mean, one way is voluntary giving. And that's a very important way because it enables us to exercise the virtue of liberality. And we want to exercise virtue. And so we want to encourage people to give, not just to have the money taken from them. Second, we can use our money to help others. So for example, if we start a business, I mean, that might conduce to our own benefit to some extent, but it also means that other people have employment and other things are done for society. So investing the money in productive activities is also beneficial. And then third, there's also taxation. That is government basically taking money and then giving some money from some people to other people, in effect. That is, for instance, taxing some people who are much wealthier at a somewhat higher level than people who don't earn as much or don't own as much wealth. And that taxation is a useful thing because it goes beyond just voluntary giving and works on the problem we mentioned earlier of the free rider. What if you have somebody who has superfluous wealth, but who says, well, I'll just let the other people who have superfluous wealth take care of the needy, and I'll just use my own money for myself. In some sense, that's unjust. I mean, they too have an obligation to share. And so some measure of government taxation that might redistribute money in some limited way might be desirable. But of course, we're not talking about certainly confiscatory taxation. And we're not talking about getting into a position where government is making all of these decisions, because that would undermine the value of, for instance, as I mentioned, voluntary giving or the productive enterprises that individuals begin, which is, again, another way of them developing themselves. So there are lots of ways of achieving common use that are not simply governmental programs. And it's important for us to understand that when we emphasize this idea that there is a certain kind of moral obligation to use our superfluous wealth to help other people. Now, in fact, of those three methods, the everything being owned and used in common, or everything being privately owned and privately used, and the third method, the private ownership with common use, I think this last method is the superior one, and I think it's what characterizes American society. It's funny that sometimes Americans, and perhaps especially American conservatives, have a tendency to talk about American society as if it were based on an absolute private property right. But the fact of the matter is that there are many ways in our society that we make sure that in addition to having the benefits of private property, we also make sure that we achieve to a great degree the universal destination of goods. That most people in our society, almost everybody in our society, I think, although this is something that could be debated, has access to the fundamental things that they need in life. In fact, I think in some ways it's a much more serious question about whether the whole world can say that. But part of that is because in many parts of the world they have political and economic systems that don't permit the kind of self-development that comes from a system based on free constitutional government. But the bottom line is that sometimes America does better than it talks. It does recognize the importance of private property, but it also has a system that makes sure that people have access to the resources they need to develop themselves, which is ultimately the whole goal of property.